Great. So welcome to the session. My name is Vivian and I work in the user support team at EDINA, who run the Digimap collections. I'm joined today by my colleague Emma Diffley, who's one of our geospatial managers here. We're also really happy to have Rick Crowhurst from Landmark UK with us. EDINA licensed the historical maps from Landmark UK, so Rick's been heavily involved with EDINA for a long time in terms of giving us access to the maps and in terms of the initial digitation of the maps. So we're looking forward to hearing from Rick about that process and what he can tell us about the map archive that we hold within Historic Digimap. Following Rick's presentation, we'll have some time for questions, and then I will give you a demo of Historic Rome. As I said, please do keep the questions coming in the chat. Emma's going to be checking the chat all the time, and if she can answer your questions, she will. But of course, there is time to ask Rick questions as well following his content. So Rick, is it okay if you share your screen with us now?
Hi, yes, Viv. Hi, I will do that. I'll screen share. Thanks to everyone. I'm sorry,
Thank you very much.
Small family crisis there that I had to deal with before I came on, but I'm fine in here now. So what I'll do is I'll screen share, and what I'll is run through some of the details that we talked about before with regards to historical mapping and the archives that Landmark have created and provided obviously through the Digimap project. I will need to leave by 1:15, unfortunately, as I've got another meeting to attend to. I've got to physically go to a meeting, which is unusual at the moment, but I have got to do that. But hopefully this gives us plenty of time to look at things and go through some questions before Viv and Emma take you through Rome. So let's have, sorry, was that the question there, Viv?
No, I was just saying thank you, Rick. I can't see, Emma, could you double check that Rick is in as a co-presenter? Oh, he started screen sharing.
There we go. I've just come to screen sharing. Hopefully that should work for you all.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I can see that, Rick. So sometimes it just takes a little bit of time for everyone to everything to catch up. So it's all working now, I think.
Excellent, excellent. So let's go, and hopefully this will do. Brilliant. So that's showing as a standard presentation. Unfortunately, it does mean that I see myself here. So I'm going to rid myself of my video. But that hopefully good. I can still see the screen. I'm hoping you can all still see the screen.
Yeah, looks good.
Lovely, lovely. I'm not heavily a Zoom user, so that's on those. So my name's Rick Crowhurst. As Viv alluded to, I've been with Landmark since we started, and we started this project back in 1995. And though Landmark's aim has always been to bring together as much information as is known about land, property, the whole property cycle, and asset cycle in the UK. And at the centre point of that was building a database of information. So we are a very large collector of data. We're a very large holder of data. We have sort of 400 odd different data partnerships, and that have been built on those over the last sort of 25 years. And at the heart of that is two key partnerships with Ordnance Survey, one of which is a complete joint venture, which is our points of interest data, which you may have come across, Point X or OS points of interest. I think you have that within the Digimap setup. That is run and maintained by my colleagues and my team in Exeter. So that's a joint venture between ourselves and OS. We do all the work, I hasten to add, but it is a joint venture product. So that's how we work on there. The other product that we've worked on, the other database that we worked on with OS is the Historical Mapping Archive. So we began in 95 to scan and georectify the historical mapping, beginning with the mid-1800s. So that's what we were looking for, and that was our start point. And I'll talk about the data in a bit more detail, but there's millions of maps in the archive because we've built on that over time. Initial 3-year project to scan and digitize, and then we've added additional archives as they've become available to us. Again, taking the original maps, often scanning and georectifying. If it's digital data, it's fine. We can just make it fit with the database. So you have a single geospatial database of information built around this core historical mapping, all linking to modern OS master map topography, and in Northern Ireland with OSNI topography. So that was the aim of our entire database, and obviously to feed in. And so the Historical Archive is a centre point of that. So as I say, we have many more data sets, over 700 plus different data sets, thousands of different data providers. As we always like to say, over 1 billion unique data features sitting in that database, with the historical mapping as a raster sitting in there as the core that everything is built around and linked to and digitized off. We create data from the historical mapping. We've digitized elements for various clients. We've looked at coastal erosion. We've looked at industrial land use. We've looked at the growth of railways. We've looked at the expansion of towns and cities, all using historical mapping and being able to digitize from that and map it onto modern geography. So that's obviously our aim with the data. So what we did, this is just a quick skim through. That's some of the people that we work with and for, and as you can see, a lot of that is central government, but not exclusively. And this is the archive that we're talking about predominantly here. And this is our historical map archive, as we call it, the historical map data. I always get a little bit pedantic about people calling it an historic map archive. It is historic in that it was the first time it was digitized, but the maps themselves are historical. You could call the first one historic because it was. So OS began, obviously, for those of you, a little potted history of OS, they began in the late 1700s, 1797, if I remember correctly, obviously linked very much to the military and concerned about invasion, and started to do uniform mapping in the early 1800s, concerned about the Napoleonic invasion, to be fair. And then once that subsided and some of the other issues, we then started to look at the idea of a uniform mapping for GB. And that was set up in the early sort of 1840s. They began to map parts of the Northwest at the rural scale, the 1 to 10, 560 scale. And then that was rapidly expanded to a more detailed scale for urban areas. So one of the reasons we always think they began in the Northwest is a lot of the cartographers had been in Ireland, mapping Ireland, and they brought the surveyors and cartographers over and mapped the Northwest to begin with. And then it was expanded down into the Southeast to look at the coast and the urban areas. So these are the maps. The first 3 items that you can see there are housed within Digimap. So you have the town plans, which were very detailed mapping, the most detailed pre-war mapping, in fact. Initially colour mapping, but our imagery is always black and white or grayscale. That does mean that we can create a digital map much more agile, a much more effective mapping, that storage is much easier. And the colour scheme in the town plans, though beautiful to look at, didn't actually add much in terms of knowledge. It was whether it was a building or a river or green space, which the maps themselves are very easy to tell that is the case. So with town plans, they centred on urban areas with anything more than 4,000 residents. So mostly it's all the big cities and towns in the Victorian era. So we're talking again 1860, the first series here of town plans. And then if you're in a larger conurbation, London, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, you got more than one series. So they were revised for those larger towns. But most smaller towns just have one series, but they are incredibly detailed maps. When you see steps to a building, they will be the number of steps. You can see the outline of public parks and gardens. And in public buildings, libraries, large castles, if you look at the House of Commons, for example, the Palace of Westminster on the town plans, you'll it will tell you where various rooms are and what is being used in those rooms on those town plans. That isn't the case on the standard county series, but they are still the most used maps. The 1 to 2,500 county series mapping is the pre-war, and then we went into the post-war period, which we'll talk about in a moment. The county series, as the name suggests, goes on a county-by-county basis. They had the various meridians running down through Great Britain that became the centre point. County series maps were rectangles rather than squares. You had different surveyor teams, which presents its own issues, which we'll touch on in a moment. And most areas were surveyed at 1 to 2,500. It's the prime urban scale. If you're in moorland or highland, you may only find 1 to 10,560, so that's 6 inches to the mile, as opposed to 25 inch to the mile for the 2,500. So less detailed mapping on the 10,560, much bigger maps, but for moorland and highland, it's not so relevant to worry about the urban buildings. But most people, most of the time, will be looking to work with the 1 to 2,500 because it's pretty uniform across the country, pretty complete. And it then ran into the National Grid series, which is item 3 on that listing there. 1 to 2,500 remains the prime urban scale, though when the National Grid was introduced in 1938 by Ordnance Survey, so the whole of the country was split up into squares, little grids, which is much easier to work with than the old county overlapping, which we'll again talk about in a short while. But they introduced a more detailed urban scale, the 1 to 1250 scale, which are the quarter sheets of the 2,500. And because the way the National Grid, with the county series, Ordnance Survey did an initial survey and then 3 revisions. So though we call them 4 epochs, epoch 1, 2, 3, 4, epoch 1 is the first edition or versions of the first edition. Epoch 2 is the first revision of the first edition. So everything revises from that original first map. In theory, OS Master Map, the current digital mapping, is just another version of the revision of those very first maps of the county series, and they just keep amending. So they did those 4 series in the pre-war period. They do go down in number, in that you'll find that Epoch 1 should be relatively complete, and there are very few, but there are an odd couple of missing maps in there that may have got damaged over time, or we've never been able to find a replacement. But the first series is a complete archive. They then revise that down. So Epoch 2 is almost as complete, but in Epoch 3 and 4, just after the First World War and between the wars leading up to the Second World War, OS really only produced maps where it was relevant. And sometimes they actually redacted maps that were for security reasons. So they would just not produce the map, especially at late 1930s as war was imminent. Ordnance Survey just redacted maps that were never published. So they took some of that idea into the National Grid. In 1938, they produced the National Grid, but we didn't start seeing maps under that series and that projection until after the Second World War. And what they do there is they monitor for units of change. So you're looking in each of those little squares for where there is change. And that's how they monitor mapping. Again, we'll touch on that in a little while. So the date is reflecting what was happening on the ground. So you'll see quite a lot of maps in the post-war period, in the late 40s and the 50s, a lot of post-war development. Then there might not be a great deal until the 1970s. After the Town and Country Planning Act, we get a host of new maps in the kind of 74, 75 period. And then obviously quite a lot in the 80s when there was a lot of loosening of shackles of planning, depending on your point of view, but there was quite a lot of planning and a lot of development in the 80s, which triggered new maps. The final series on there, the Sim, Suzy and Superplan, those are in our archive, but they are not in the Digimap archive. They were the working microfiche by the surveyors in the post-war period. So they give us extra detail. They'll have some unpublished information. They'll also have information where it says Suzy is surveyors' unpublished survey information. In the 1970s, Ordnance Survey introduced their digital mapping within Ordnance Survey, housed in Southampton. And so they transported what was on the unpublished microfiche onto the digital version. And so those unpublished microfiche were never turned into physical maps. The SIM, the surveyor's information on microfiche, was their working microfiche. They would be recording little bits of change that then would build up once the threshold was passed to trigger a map. And that's how we have that there. So that map archive is still available if anybody wanted to take that into the Digimap, or if any individual wanted to purchase individual little bits of mapping or little bits of data, that's still possible as well. Our archive also hosts a whole raft of other maps that we built on over time, Soviet spy maps that we have in the archive. We have Goad fire insurance plans that we have in the archive, all built around the original mainframe. They're not within Digimap, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but if there are maps that you're looking for and you want to fire a question off to Emma and her team, they can always fire them back to us and we can see if there's anything that we hold that might be an addition. So for those of you who are quite geeky over mapping, like I am, there's a little bit of an idea. That's for England and Wales. Obviously, it does cover Scotland. The archive does cover Scotland, but those maps just show the county series and the gridding system for England and Wales. So the old county series, Cassini projection, Giacomo Cassini before the introduction of the national grid. Old series mapping, rectangles based on a county. So each county was sort of surveyed and those series of maps were surveyed for them. And then the introduction of the national grid, which obviously goes to a different north and a different projection and the national grid projection, and makes a more uniform picture for the country, which does mean that we don't get county overlaps. The way we structure our data, we've always said that we end up with kind of three primary scales, town and prime urban. So the town plans, the 1 to 500, 1 to 528, the 1 to 1056 scales. And then in the post-war period, those 1 to 1250s, we will count those almost as town plans. They're of a similar nature, a similar kind of detail, and they're only for the urban areas. And then you have the sort of major urban maps, the blue ones there as we would regard them, which is the 1 to 2500 scale, which obviously runs from the first edition, first county series, Epoch 1, all the way through to the very last epoch that we held in the data, which is around 95, 96. That's when OS regard the historical archive as stopping. So that's our end point for the archive. The super plans, we do have some super plans that give us sort of 97, 98, and it would depend on use as to whether we're allowed to provide those through. We use them for some of our test cases. We also have the rural scale, which is the 1 to 10,560, that then morphs into the 1 to 10,000 as we go into the 1950s onwards. So that's what the coverage looks like, and that's the coverage that you will hold within Digimap. As you'll see, town plans are, as you'd expect for Scotland, it's the central belt, and you can all spot Aberdeen and Inverness in there. And as you'll see, the town plans coverage is, as you would expect, for both the pre-war period and the post-war period. The 1 to 1250 really covers those urban areas. The primary urban scales, the 1 to 2500, much more uniform, but you can still see those pockets of moorland and highland and Brecons and the Highlands of Scotland and the Lake District and down into Dartmoor that were only covered at 10,560 and 10,000, which is why when we look at the rural scale in the green, you'll see that's pretty much blanket coverage. I don't think there's anywhere that does not have at least a 1 to 10,560 or a 10,000 map, even if it doesn't have more detailed mapping. So just to give an idea, this is a kind of coming from our system, not from Rome. This is kind of our WMS system, which is very easy for me to pop in and out from. And you'll see the kind of an idea of the sweep at the bottom of from our time slider, which shows us the range which we set. This is setting this particular part of Manchester between 1886 and 1896, and it's showing me a 1 to 10,560 map of Lancashire and Furness, and that's showing that barracks there. That's 1891. I can then go through in the system, going through here to the same area, but at the more detailed scale. This is the 1 to 2,500, and you can start to see some of the detail that you would expect on these kind of maps. Individual buildings, I know individual buildings. You can see the street names much more easily. You can start to see some of the text around about what's going on in the building. And the Duke of York pub is up in the top. If you follow that green line above the 1891, that's being shown there, and we can do some text analysis, which is what we do back at Landmark, and many of our users have done over time, and as have the academic community. That's a town plan, so we've gone back in time here. We've popped back to the 1850s, but so less development around, but we're starting to see, and if we were to zoom in here, we start to see a great deal more text in elements, and individual buildings are shown. And if you see where it says drying ground, if you go to the red cross and just go straight across to your right or to the east there, you see it says drying ground, and then you'll start to see some gardens actually defined as to what's going on in their gardens. And so that's the kind of level of detail you get from a town plan. And we can go forward through the time. Now we've moved up, you'll see the time slide has changed, and we're now in the 1960s. So that map in the middle is the 1960 map, and start to show us where the barracks went, but we have a war memorial and the recreation ground and Coronation Street, which is one of the reasons why that came up, and the Salford Lads Club, if you know your Manchester. And that's how that goes through the archive. There are a couple of issues that we always like to point out when working with the historical mapping, in particular the pre-war stuff. When we look at the pre-war period, we will get overlapping counties. So, and in some cases, if we look at Devon in 1914, there on the left side, and Cornwall on the right, in the Devon case, the surveyors and the cartographers mapped Cornwall. So they are showing a bit of Cornwall on their maps. On the Cornish side, they stopped at the boundary of Devonshire. So you have white space. So exactly the same geography, exactly the same series or relative time, 1914, but we have a selection of maps. So you will find that you might have two maps at the same point, at the same time, but surveyed by different teams and different cartographers. So we do not slice off between the counties and create a stitched together seamless one, because that information could be important, and it is important to us to know in both cases what was being mapped. The same issue can happen with different scales. So you can get the same point, same time, but at different scales. So here we have the promenade around Torquay, in fact this is, in Devon, and on the left is the 1 to 2,500, 1895 map, still a very fine map, lots of information on the promenade and pier and the Reform Beach. And then you have the town plan at 1 to 500, which is even more detailed, and we could zoom in there and look at that pavilion in more detail if we wish to. Exactly the same geography, exactly the same time period, but a different scale. So it's always worth checking at what scale is most important to you and where you wish to look at. With every of these maps, especially in the pre-war period, they all had their own cartography and they had their own cartographic symbology. These legends, clearer than the one I've got there for you on this screen, have been provided, and they're built in, I believe, into the system. So there are questions, if there are questions about what a particular symbol means, you can always sort of ask us those questions as we go. But the key symbology is provided as part of the metadata. So that was a very rough guide, and I'm trying to stay within my guideline of about half an hour. I'm going to stop screen sharing, and appreciate there might be questions that come out. I know it's, oh yes, and that was a point from Emma to say that the points of interest is available to the Digimap OS collection. Thank you, Emma. Any questions on that, you can always ask me as well, though we don't supply that to Digimap. It comes to our partners at OS. It's exactly the same data. But we also have a Northern Ireland bolt-on if you ever needed that to take that in.
We don't have the Northern Ireland
you don't have the Northern Ireland
data, no.
You could do. There's no reason why you can't.
The POI that comes to us through OS is available both in Rome as a sort of points overlay, or you can download it in sections depending on which bits you need. Once you download it, you can select it by area, but you can also select to have particular themes within it as well. So you don't have to have the whole lot if you don't need the whole lot, which is quite useful.
So I appreciate that was a very quick run through of what's available and some of the key questions that we've had before, both from this community and from others. But I'm happy to take any other questions about the data and about kind of what you have available. And obviously, if there's ever any additional cartography or additional data that you're interested in, we're always happy to deal with that on an individual basis.
That's really useful. Thanks, Rick. I can't see any questions coming in. Viv, have you got anything you want to chip in?
I don't think so. Just to say thanks, Rick. It's really comprehensive and great to get such a clear breakdown of the different map series that are available.
Yeah.
If there's no more questions coming in right now, I can flip over and do a little demo of Historic Rome so that people can see how they browse the maps within.
Well, if it's there was a quick question from Duncan. Have you attempted to vectorize any of it? We've only vectorized little bits. We haven't vectorized the data. It's a very good question. If somebody, bearing in mind that we are a commercial company, unfortunately, not unfortunately, but that's kind of just the way it is. We're not funded to create this, so it would have needed OS to say yes, we would like a vector version of 1950, or somebody else to ask us that question. But we have digitized off individual elements that we have done. We did a big study on contaminated land. As I say, we did provide some work on coastal erosion. Basically by putting the historical layers at various time periods to try and look at how coasts have changed. Obviously, that's a tricky business because they are tricky by their very nature. But no, we haven't. We haven't vectorized any of it yet. Could do, but not yet. I
don't suppose there's anything stopping people vectorizing their own little patches.
Certainly not within your community. No. I mean, there would be slight IPR issues if somebody then wanted to go and sell it as a data set. But in terms of, I mean, that's what it's designed for. It's designed to make it so as analysing the mapping is so much easier in modern geography. That's pretty much the whole purpose of digitizing it in the first place.
Yeah. Yes, it's hugely valuable. Somebody's asking, what does vectorize mean? Vectorizing means turning it from an image as it is at the moment, which is it's like a photograph at the moment, turning it into a series of points and lines and polygons so that you've got a greater degree of control over what scale you display it at and how it looks in that scale and so on.
A bit like getting a sheet of tracing paper.
Yes.
And tracing the image underneath. Slightly cleverer than that, but that's the analogy I always use.
Yeah. But it means that when you can, if you want to zoom in on it, you don't get the little pixelated squares that you get with the raster image that we have at the moment. That's the biggest and most obvious difference, I suppose. And
the other thing with vector data is you can then add text elements attributed to the vector. So as we have done with contaminated land study, you take a coal mine, you draw out the image, and then you could say this was a coal mine in 1851, in 1896, this is the shape of it, and you can then overlay that in all sorts of different ways.
Yes.
So that's the reason.
Makes it a bit more powerful, maybe, for doing other things with. Yeah. I think if we've got no more questions for Rick, then we've had probably let Rick move on to his next meeting. It's non-stop, isn't it?
Yeah, I will now leave, but if there are any other questions after the event, please do let us know, and I can always feed those through Emma and Viv in constant touch, so that's good.
Yeah, we'll do that. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thanks for your time.
Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, I'm just going to quickly move on then and share my screen so I can give you guys a little demo of Historic Rome where you can browse the maps. Let me maximize the browser. Okay, so Emma, if there's anything that you want to chip in as I'm going through, please feel free.
Yeah, I'll just interrupt.
Yeah, and likewise, people, please just put any questions you've got, anything you want us to show you in the chat box, and we can adjust what we're doing. So this is Historic Digimap. So we've got our Historic Rome application here where you can browse, view the maps that Rick has been talking about. Once you find a map that you're interested in, if you want to export it, your options would be to export it from here as a PDF or a PNG or JPEG image. Historic data download is where you can actually download the raw mapping data. So when Rick and Emma were just talking about the vectorizing of data, what you're getting in here are actually raster images. They're the scanned map images, but they're georeferenced. So that means you could take the image of the map and use it in some other software, overlay your own data on it and so on. So if you're using the maps in additional software to do analysis, data download would be for you. If you just need a reference map or you want to browse the maps, Historic Rome is the application you would go for. So this is what Historic Rome looks like. All of the Rome applications for our different Digimap collections work in the same way, but some have some additional features just to make the most of the map data. And Historic Rome is one of those because we have this timeline going along the top so that you can select the decade of interest. There's various other features which are useful, which I'll go through as we go. So first off, I'm going to search for York. There's the search box at the top, and I've selected York from the results. So that's taken me to this, this map of York. Now, the first map that you load in Historic Rome, whenever you log in, it will always give you the earliest available decade. So this has taken me to an 1850s map, which I can see because it's highlighted in blue on the timeline here. All the white highlighted decades are ones where there are also maps available for this scale. So Rick was talking about the different types of maps that we have, the county series, national grid, and so on. This will be a county series map at the scale we're at. But the way to be sure of the map you're looking at is to use this information button at the top here. So you select the information button and then just click anywhere on the map and it will tell you what it is you're looking at. So this information box pops up to tell me this is a county sheet for Yorkshire, and that's the county series 1 to 10,560 scale. And it gives you not the year of survey, but the year of publication, which was 1853. So that's how you find out exactly what you're looking at by using the little information button at the top. So at this scale, there are maps at these decades which are highlighted in white, and you simply select any decade that you're interested in. Now, as you zoom in and out, if you see the scale bar over on the right here, it's split into two sections: modern at the bottom, where you can view contemporary mapping, and historic on the top. So each of these notches, as I zoom in, you'll see the little bar. Let me turn the information off. As I zoom in, it will move up a notch, and I can keep zooming in to see things in more and more detail. Now you have to notice that the timeline, the decade availability changes as you zoom in and out. There simply won't be a map available for every decade and at every scale. As you saw from Rick's coverage map, things were surveyed periodically, and you won't find something for every decade at each scale. So this one I'm looking at now, maybe one of those urban scale ones. Yes, that Rick mentioned, the county series 1 to 2,500 scale, published 1937. Now there's one tip I want to give you guys in relation to the town plan maps, the really detailed stuff. The tip is simply just to keep zooming in. If you reach a point where it says, okay, there's nothing available here for any decade, you can just keep going. For this particular point, it's saying there is one for the 1850s. And this is an example of a town plan. So that's really just the key thing, is just to keep zooming in. Often there may not be one of those urban scale maps for a particular location and decade, but there may well be a town plan. Those, as Rick said, these are for locations, towns which had a population of more than 4,000 at the time. But these are the really fun stuff which you could spend hours looking at, you know, with all the different business names and so on. So do just keep zooming in to try and find town plans. Now, the next thing I wanted to show you was the how to deal with the overlapping map issue that Rick mentioned. So London's always the most straightforward place to show this. So I've selected London, and you can see that your map looks really blurry, and it's hard to sort of tell what's going on. And that's because there are several maps available of this area for this decade. So we're in the 1890s. So there's been lots of different counties have surveyed the London, and they're all made available within the Rome mapper. There isn't really a way, is there, for us to distinguish, you know, which one would we display from these four county maps for this particular
everybody's view would be different. Everybody might want to see a different one. So it's I think some of it is dependent upon the particular decade you're looking at and which scale you're looking at and so on. The coverage is so patchy in that sense that it's really hard to come up with a consistent way of always showing the same thing, because it depends on what you set first. So you just have to have a look at the overlapping ones and pick the ones you want.
Yeah, so the overlapping map selection is available in the sidebar that runs down the left here. So it's just asking me which county I want to view. So I'm going to go for Middlesex, which you can see. Okay, we're now just clearly displaying one map, which is a lot clearer to see. Later on, I'm going to take you into data download just to show you how you can get a visual of the actual coverage for each of the different map series that we hold. So that's the overlapping maps. I'm not going into great detail on how to use Zoom here. There are lots of different features such as drawing tools, importing data. I don't have time to go into all of that today, but we do have an introductory webinar in 2 weeks' time, which you'll get an invite to join as well. And that would give you more detail on how to use all of Rome's different features. Now, actually, what I'm going to do now is pull up a map that I made last week from my saved maps. And this is just of a location in central Scotland, which I was just looking at because it's the Antonine Wall runs through this location. And so I was just trying to find, here we are. I was just trying to find a map that mentioned the Antonine Wall. So here we are. The other feature I want to show you is this 2-up view here. So this allows me to compare two maps of a location at the same scale, but from different decades. So I'm on the 1860s on the left, so I could go to, let's go for the 1960s. And still not a lot going on there. I know there's lots of housing in this area now, but none of it particularly visible in the 1960s. If I switch to a contemporary map, you'll see that, yeah, okay, I do get a better comparison of what's going on in this area now, and that there's some development has gone on. Now, we did have a question prior to the webinar from one of the participants to say they feel that the contemporary maps that we're displaying here are not particularly helpful, they're not particularly detailed. And we're displaying these less detailed maps really for licensing issues. We haven't got the license to display the very, very detailed mapping that we have available in the Ordnance Survey collection here. But I'm going to try and show you a little workaround for that. I don't know if you've got anything else you want to say on that at this point, Emma.
Yeah, Viv, the interesting bit here is that while we have the OS maps and we have a license for them, we have a technical problem in working out who is able to see those maps. So it would be very interesting to know what people think of which maps they would like to see in the contemporary section, whether master map would be, the very, very detailed stuff is the most appropriate, or whether we could get away with something that's maybe less detailed, but still a bit more detailed than the open data we've got there. The difficulty is that every user has to agree to an OS license agreement and the historic license agreement. the Ordnance Survey create their end user license agreement, the EULA, that runs between Ordnance Survey and the individual, not between EDINA and the individual. So we aren't allowed to mess with that EULA. But in some way, we have to assess whether an individual has assigned both licenses, for want of a better phrase. And doing that is more complicated than it sounds, given that the way the authentication works with Digimap. We think there may be ways around it. It's a question of time and resource as to whether we can implement it. But if there are other maps that you think would be better than the open data that's there at the moment, even if they are less, maybe a smaller scale rather than a larger scale, it'd be interesting to know what your preferences would be, I think.
Super, thank you, Emma. What I'm going to do is show you guys how you can go into this overlays menu on the left-hand side here. So within the overlays menu in Historic Rome, you've got the ability to add something called a web map service. So that's basically a feed of maps, of mapping images from another provider. So for example, some of the environment agencies have web map services, which I have used to feed into Digimap and combine with the maps that we offer. But Digimap also offer them as well. So what I'm going to do is go back out to the homepage, the Digimap homepage, I should say, and I'm going to show you within the Ordnance Survey collection. You'll see there's another box on here under Roman Data Download. We have a web services box. So this is where you will find our web map service links. So what I want to do is copy this link and take it into Historic Rome. So how we would do that would be to select the link and copy it. I think we have a little video on how to do this. It's a pretty simple process, but there is a video on our YouTube channel showing you how to do it. And then select Historic and go back into Historic Rome. And then within the overlays, you would say manually add WMS feed and paste that link into the box and say get layers. So this is then giving you the ability to view the Ordnance Survey mapping within Historic Digimap. You can then select the ones you want and say add layers to map. I'm going to close that now because I've already got this feed within here. But first I'm going to go back to my map of that area in Scotland. And then I'll go and switch on my Ordnance Survey web map service. And we should see some contemporary mapping there. Okay, so I can then zoom in and I can see all these building outlines that are there. I can only view the buildings. I can't, sorry, Emma, did you say something?
No.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I felt I had some sort of feedback. And you can only view the buildings. You can't, customize the Ordnance Survey map to remove different features or anything like that. But this is the workaround that we have available right now to cover the fact that that contemporary mapping perhaps isn't as detailed as some users might like. So those are, that's everything I wanted to show you. I just wanted to highlight some of the features that are useful within Historic Rome. I'll very quickly flip over to Historic Download.
Viv, can I add one thing?
Yes.
Just to say that when you add that WMS feed, it should persist. So you shouldn't need to add it every time you want to look at the modern maps with the historical on top. That WMS feed should stay present even after you log out and log back in again.
Yeah, great. Okay. And the last thing I wanted to show is just this little arrow up at the top on the top toolbar says use this area in data download. So if I select that, it'll open our data download, Historic data download in another window. And I don't seem to see my area, but no matter. Let's zoom right out. And then I really just came in here to show you how you can view coverage. So on the left-hand side here, we've got all the different map series. So let's say I'm interested in the really early town plans between 1856 and 1911. And these are split into different editions covering different time periods. If I click on that little grid, it then shows me, it shades the areas where there are town plans available. Okay, and I could try the second edition one instead. And it will shade in purple all the places where there are plans. So if you really need a specific town plan for a location, these little grid tools allow you to see where there's coverage. So these are kind of akin to the maps that Rick showed you in his presentation. So this one is a county series map where there's obviously far greater coverage. And you can see, as Rick said, there's just some blank areas in the Highlands and Moorlands and so on. So that's all I've got. I don't want to take up any more time because I can see we might have some questions. Is there anything people are requesting to have demoed, Emma? Or?
Sorry, I've got my mute on. We've got a request to add master map to the contemporary maps. I agree, Jamie, that would be ideal, especially when you're looking at the very detailed town plans. Yeah. As I said, the complexity is the technical one of sorting out the licenses. We've been asked, can we overlay the downloaded map viewed in 2UP? So I think what David is asking is whether you can put the map from the WMS feed into one of the 2UP windows. No, I don't think that's possible. You can't display the WMS feed on its own in one of those 2UP windows. That doesn't quite work. I tell you what I have never tried, Viv, maybe you can help me out here, is whether if you add the WMS feed to one of the maps and then do 2UP, whether the WMS feed is still visible.
Okay,
I ought to know that, but I'm ashamed to say I don't.
I have a feeling it. I don't know. Let's try it. Okay, so let's pull up the map that I was using it on. Add in our OS. It's already there. It is persisting from.
Yeah. Before. So if you now hit the 2UP map, what happens then?
And
oh yes, there you go. It stays in one. So if you change the transparency on the left-hand map, the one with the WMS feed in it, you might be able to. You might have to change it in the side panel actually, Viv.
Oh, on the web map service, you mean?
Yeah.
I think the transparency slider on this is for the historical mapping. Is that...
Yes. So it may be that the WMS feed transparency is in that panel there. There you go. So if you push that one right up, there you go. David, I think that might be as good as you can get, and I hope that will help a little bit. I'm sorry to say I didn't know the answer to that question initially. That looks as though it might work. Yeah, good. Okay. Well, we all learned something new there. That was useful. I agree that, Viv, that the contemporary maps at the moment are not hugely helpful in many cases. Sometimes they are. They still contain the contours and a good indication of what is now urban area that previously was not.
Yes, I guess it depends on the scale of the historical map that you're reviewing.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. We've used it because it's open data and therefore we have no licensing issues with it. Clearly, when there are better open data sets, we should put those in. If we can sort the licensing issue, then yes, I agree that would be a huge improvement.
Okay, well, that's all I've got to show people. If there are any questions that people think of later, please feel free just to email me. You'll have my email address from the Zoom invite. We will send you a recording of this and Rick's content as well. And I think that's it, really. I don't know if you've got anything else you want to add, Emma.
No, I don't think so. For the records, I'm going to type into the chat the discovery we've just made about the WMS feed transparency, making it a bit easier to view the contemporary stuff from the WMS feed with the historical maps on the other side. Great. So I'll just make sure that's in the chat so that when you get the transcript, you can see the correct answer rather than the one I gave earlier, which was obviously not quite correct.
Great. And we may well ask, do some follow-up on, what contemporary mapping would be most useful within historic Rome. So yeah, we just urge you to, if you get a little survey or something, please do respond to give us some, a basis for what to include when time and money permits.
Yeah. I've got one more thing. Jamie has said that the fact that we make it work in society is the bugbear. No, Jamie, Society Digimap works in a slightly different way. You cannot subscribe to Society Digimap without subscribing to the OS collection. So the dependency and the licensing works in a different way, whereas we do not bind together the subscriptions for the historic service and the OS service. So it's a different problem. I get where you're coming from, but technically speaking, the problem is different.
Okay, so thank you very much for coming along, everyone. And we've got some more of these webinars coming up in the next few weeks, which I'll advertise to you again. So keep an eye out for that. And thanks again.